Welcome, everyone, to our weekly What Can I Do with My PhD seminar series. This week, we have Dr. Kelly Pike, who is Head of Translational Sciences at Ventus Therapeutics. She has a PhD in Immunology from the University of Toronto, and she also completed postdoctoral studies at the Lunenfeld-Tanenbaum Research Institute in Toronto. Her career path was not linear. She did several side trips along the way and moved from fundamental research focused on immune system of chickens to being a drug developer now and designing translational strategies to bring therapeutics to the clinic. So Kelly's going to tell us today about her transition from academia to industry and the challenges that you can face in doing that. If you would like to ask a question throughout the presentation, you can either use the raise hand function or you can type it in the meeting chat, and I will monitor the meeting chat and I will let you know if there's a question, Kelly. Good?
Yeah. Yep.
All right, I've got your slides.
Okay, perfect. So please ask questions as we go. Interrupt me. I haven't prepared a sort of a formal presentation. I really put together some slides to tell of my story and my journey, career path. And so this is very, I see this as an informal dialogue, so please don't hesitate to interrupt. So if we move to the first slide, what I wanted to do is give you an overview of my path, and then I'll dive into a bit of what it is I do as a drug developer. What I've come to realize is that students, both undergrads and graduate students, don't very often have a good sense of what someone in biotech actually does and what's involved and what aspects of drug discovery you focus on with my type of background. And then I'll give you a sense of the differences between biotech and big pharma, because that's also something that I feel is often, not talked about, and students in particular are not exposed to. And it's really two very distinct environments. So in terms of who I am, I did my PhD in immunology at the University of Toronto. And as Leslie referred to, I was focused on chicken immunology. So really, really far from where I am now. But what I've stated here is that this was really what gave me a good, solid foundation in science. It was during that time that I was really trained in terms of how to ask the right questions and then how to design the right experiments to address those questions. And that foundation has carried with me from then all the way till now. And so even though your PhD might not be in the area that you ultimately end up in, it does have tremendous value just in terms of defining you and developing you as a scientist. Following my PhD, I went on to do postdoctoral studies. Here, I didn't continue in chicken, but I did go to one of those rather large competitive labs with many postdocs on a vast, focused on many different topics. And during that time, I did develop, and acquire certain skills that I think are still helping me today in terms of how to work in a multidisciplinary environment, how to work with other scientists who don't have the same background or expertise as you, and so in fact don't have the same language as you. So I believe we were 2 immunologists in a lab of over 40 people, and immunologists in particular have a certain vocabulary that they tend to throw around, thinking that everybody understands it. And what I learned was how to modify my language to speak to really experienced, skilled scientists, but who just didn't know what all these immunological terms meant. The other thing that I learned was how to be prepared, because different scientists are going to look at the same question based on their experience from a different angle. And actually, it's really enriching if you are open and willing to listen to a different scientist from a different perspective. And learning how to work and field with those types of scientists, how to field their questions, is really important in terms of enriching your science and addressing questions holistically. I then was faced with, life changes. My husband was moving to a different city to open his own lab. I was a little behind him in terms of my career path. So I ended up going to McGill as a research associate. I, at that time, really wanted to stay in academia. So I found a lab that was looking for a really a senior scientist, and it was a great opportunity because I was allowed to apply for my own grants. I learned how to manage projects, how to work with reports under me, how to sell my science as I was applying for grants. So although it to some might have seemed like my career sort of stalled at that point, it was a very it was a few years of really learning, acquiring certain important skills. It also opened the door into biotech for myself. So if you move to the next slide, what happened was, as I was working in as a research associate in an academic lab, that academic lab had a collaboration with a small biotech that was opening. And they had asked me to perform some experiments in the lab to support the work that was ongoing in the biotech. They were really small. It was a virtual company, just a handful of employees. And I'll be honest, I didn't want to do it at that point. I was dragged into it kicking and screaming because my idea was to stay in academia. But I did it for my mentor who needed the help. And a lesson learned from that is seize every opportunity, even though it might at the time not seem really helpful or aligned with your path. It's a new experience, and I would highly encourage you to take it, because what it opened my eyes up to was just how all this basic science that I was always so interested in studying could be translated and moved towards developing therapeutics that could really have impact on patient health and life quality. And so the small molecule company, or the biotech that was working with my mentor, was in fact led by former Merck Frost employees. And so again, which I'm sure many of you hear this over and over again, it's about your network and who you know. So when there was a small molecule company called Inception Sciences opening up in Montreal, which was led by former Merck Frost employees, I had someone a network to get my CV onto the top of the pile. And so, I had spent all this time learning basic science. I had become aware of small molecule drug discovery. And then there was a new company opening in Montreal with a network that I had established. So I did, look into that possibility, especially because at that time, academia was not, the opportunities were limited, shall we say. So I did get the interview, and I would say that my connections got me the interview, but didn't get me the job, because it was my ability to communicate my science and my experience that I think really secured the job for me. And then I started as a senior scientist. And I think this is a lesson that I like to relay to people at the early stages of their career, is that as coming in from academia to industry, you know nothing. Even though you have your PhD, even though you have a postdoc, I had years as a research associate, you really know, unless you've been exceptionally lucky, do not know much about drug discovery. And so it's a steep learning curve. And I definitely had to bite my tongue and really, spent a lot of time at the bench learning basic principles of drug discovery and asking to be included in meetings so I could learn the process. But was able to slowly work my way up the ladder, eventually becoming the assistant director of biology within the company, and along the way learning a lot about leadership and how to lead a program. And then I continued to grow. The reality of biotech is that change happens; it's inevitable. And Inception Sciences ended up rebranding and reforming as Ventus Therapeutics. And I stayed during that transition, which was just a great learning experience in terms of how biotechs develop, fall, and then re-establish themselves. So a lot of business visibility during that period. Also a good learning experience that I'm not a business person. And so I quickly learned that I definitely belong on the science side of the story. And, again, this is why I say never turn away from an experience. I learned what I'm not meant to do. And so I've been with Ventus from the beginning, and I'm still here now. I'm actually senior director of translational sciences now. And what that means is I oversee sort of the basic science in terms of what disease indication we're going to select for a given program? What disease does it make the most sense for? How are we going to validate that disease? So what kind of experiments are we going to do in animal models or in profiling human patient biospecimens to feel confident that it's the right disease to go into? And then I support the development team to figure out how we're going to do this in the clinic. So which biomarkers are we going to look at? How are we going to measure them? And how are we going to analyze them? So if you move to the next slide. So that's sort of my story, and I can answer questions either now or later on that. What I have in the next few slides is sort of, if you're thinking of about going into industry, what are the questions you can ask yourself? And these are a lot of the questions I ask myself during my journey to come to decisions. I think, it seems simple, but do you really want this is an important question to ask, because so much in science is so all-consuming, whether it's in academia or industry. I know sometimes people have this really almost historic view that life is easier in industry and that it's a 9-to-5 job. I can wholeheartedly tell you it is not. It is a full commitment, and it's just as stressful as academia. It's just different. So the demand, and I'll go through this in some of the slides, what's demanded of you is just as stressful. There's just as much pressure. It's just that it's different pressure. And there's also, and I'm sure you've had discussions of this over the summer, is that there are other options besides academia and industry, and they're no less so or a waste of your PhD. So all the options like sales, MLS, medical writing, journal editing, these are all fantastic career choices that are worthy of your PhD. Don't dismiss those, I guess is my message. But what I'd like to focus on is this academia versus industry question. So if you go to the next slide, this is the big question. It was definitely a big question I faced as, I continued in academia and the options were limited. And so if you move to the next slide, and again, if we focus on academia, I think and again, this is my perspective, sorry, move forward. Really, I think for running an academic lab, you need those good ideas. They have to be your own ideas. You have to secure your funding, and then you get started. But then to survive, you still need more funding. You need graduate students. You need new ideas, new innovations, new collaborations. So I think from my perspective, that's what you really need for an academic lab. If you move forward. And I think what can be very enticing, I know I was enticed about it, it's just, you're the boss, right? So you get to hire, you get to fire, you get to decide what projects, your priorities, how to spend your money. So it does, I think it's very attractive as a career option because you have that apparent independence as an academic lab. If you move forward. You are wearing a lot of hats though. So, yes, your PI also has a slew of other responsibilities, right? They are essentially the human resources, the accountant, the writer, the professor, and the committee members. So it's a lot going on at the same time. And I think sometimes this can be overwhelming as people consider it as a career prospect. So if you move forward, and then, this is outdated, but the challenge is really is funding, securing that money to keep you going. And I remember my time in academia, this was really the stress and what always gave me a pause about, do I want to be facing this challenge of constantly being able to secure funding? I will say right here that the same is true in biotech. Biotechs are always looking to raise money to secure the company and keep the company going until they go public. And even when you go public, you have to ensure that you're still being productive and generating value to maintain the value of your company. So I think early on in our career, we get turned off by academia because this constant pressure to secure funding. But I think people need to realize that in biotech, it's the same thing. You still have to secure money. So you're not escaping that by moving into biotech. It just takes a different form. In academia, the trade is really publications. As I'm sure all of you know, and has been spoken to in previous seminars, the pressure to publish can be overwhelming. Again, there's the equivalent in industry, though. You still have to have output that you can speak to generate value and make decisions that will guide the company forward. So what I want to focus on really is the difference. So how does industry compare to the scenario I just outlined? So in terms of, where do you start when you're leading a program in a biotech? So what kind of characteristics do you need? You definitely need to have that drive to make a difference and be flexible and be patient. So many of the same characteristics that you needed to start your own lab in academia, it's just in this scenario, the company as a whole is deciding what the projects are. And so you don't need that great first idea to start in biotech and to build up your program in biotech. What you're going to need to survive in biotech is really, you need good colleagues. You do need new ideas, because we make a lot of no-go decisions in biotech. You have to be innovative. You need a lot of patience. You need to be adaptable. You need to be collaborative. So none of these are anything, out of the norm that you would see in research in an academic environment. I do think, though, that you need them a little bit more in biotech, because you're working in such a group collaborative environment. You can't just have your own lab and work in isolation. So you really need to be able to rely on your research team, as I'll get to in some of the later slides. And this is really what I was speaking to. So you have to work in collaboration with your executive team. So you don't get to decide automatically who you hire and fire. You do have to, go through that with your HR department. You have to make sure that you've gone through certain processes, that you've, if you're going to fire someone, there has to be a reason for that, and well documented and supported by other executives within the team. You have to work in terms of project progressing. So it might be that the company decides to move in a different direction. So you may, depending on where you are, be part of that team, but it's a team decision. It's not a sole PI making the decision to change directions. And the same with priorities, when to stop a project and who you collaborate with and who you don't. It's all team decisions, as opposed to it being a single principal investigator.
Kelly, in terms of the timeline for those decisions, is it in industry, is it generally, okay, we're gonna work on this for 6 months, and if it doesn't look promising, we cut the cord, or is it more day-to-day sort of decision?
I think it's both, and it depends on the context. So, I think, and the stage of the company, to be honest, but, different scenarios would be, the very big on planning go, no go, just experiments. So let's give ourselves X amount of time to perform this key experiment that's going to tell us if we move forward or not. And if it's positive, then we move forward, but we have X amount of time to get that done. Alternatively, it might be, okay, we see this great data in the literature, let's give ourselves 2 months to see if we can recapitulate it. If we can't recapitulate it, then we stop. So it really depends on the scenario, the funding of the company, how well it's, what its financial runway is. It can all of those things can impact.
One of the things you mentioned earlier as well was the funding, how, there's also competition for getting funds to support industry, not just academia. But what does an industry, like, what does competition of funds in industry look like?
Yeah. So it's not, I wouldn't say it's like direct competition like you would see for a CIHR grant, where everyone puts in their application and the top 2% get it or whatnot. But small biotechs are typically looking to venture capitalists to fund them. Venture capitalists have a finite amount of money, right? And so they are not going to give money to every single biotech that pitches to them. So you are, in a way, competing for that pool of money that these different venture capitalists have. So it's hard, because honestly, it's very similar, I find, to grant applications, because you have to ensure it's a matter of, does what you're pitching align with what their interests are right now in the venture capitalist environment? And if it's, and we see this in academia all the time, right? What's the latest, hottest thing that they're looking to fund? And it translates almost exactly into industry. So yeah, you are competing with other people. It's just not like on that time schedule that you have with grants.
Right. So when you make a pitch for funding, are you pitching the entire company, or can you pitch projects?
Typically, you're pitching an idea for a company. If you're at the, if you're looking for seed money, that would be like to get your company going. So you're pitching an idea. Series A, you're pitching, again, your company and getting your company up and running through certain milestones. And then as you're going to Series B, Series C, then you're asking for larger scopes of money, and it's about moving the company to different stages, right? If you're at Series C, maybe you're about to go into the clinic and you're looking for a larger investment. But typically it's for the entire company and not for a specific project. For specific projects, what will often happen is a collaboration with a big pharma, for example. Like we'll work, you reach out to Novartis, for example, to see, do they want to collaborate on a very specific project that you have a common interest in? And why they would do that is they have an opportunity to license it at a later time point, for example.
Okay. I'm just going to remind everybody who might have joined us late that if you have a question, you can type it into the chat, or you can use the raise hand function.
So if we move forward. So I would say though in biotech at the more entry level stages, you are wearing fewer hats than you would as an academic. Just because you have all these departments, right? You have an HR department, you have an accounting department. So I think from my perspective, you're wearing fewer hats. That being said, as you move up the ladder and you get closer to being an executive, you are responsible for a lot more. And so maybe fewer hats, but more responsibilities under each hat. And then what I want to drive home, if you are in any way afraid of failure, then drug discovery is not the space to go into. And in some ways, this is just science, right? There is just so much failure going into, as you're looking to develop a drug from the stage of screening compounds all the way to being a registered drug. It's mostly failure, and it's not failure due to, it's not personal failure, it's just science, right? And so because there's so much failure, you have to be okay with that. I know a lot of people who've spent entire careers and don't have a drug on the market, and it's not because they're not good scientists. So if you move to the next slide, I think I've outlined some of the reasons for these failures, just to give people a bit of context. So some of this is due to just safety issues or toxicology. So before a drug goes into the clinic, it goes through extensive animal testing and toxicology testing, but sometimes things are just not predicted. And so something will come up in your phase 1 where you're doing your safety studies. And as soon as you have a safety issue, that will kill your compound. Also, it can be killed because of lack of efficacy. So you have this great biological rationale, but in the end, it was incorrect. That can happen. Or there can be compensation mechanisms that you were not aware of that are only present in humans, for example. Pharmacokinetics can also be a reason to fail. So pharmacokinetics speaks to how your drug behaves in terms of how quickly it's taken up, how it's distributed throughout the body, how it's metabolized, how it's excreted. And sometimes if, for example, it's excreted too quickly in humans compared to what you've seen in previous species, then there's no way to dose it appropriately in humans, and therefore you have to kill the compound. I would say there's been an extensive amount of advances in this field in the past, I think I said here 20 years. And so usually this is not the reason for the failure. And this is just because so much has gone into predicting how the drugs will behave once they're in humans, that usually, although the prediction is not going to be spot on, it's within an acceptable range, and you get the sort of the distribution and the metabolism that you expected. And lastly, sometimes your compound can just be killed for commercial reasons. And this is something that, again, you have to accept if you're going into industry. Could be that a competitor got way ahead of you and has a drug on the market that your company feels cannot compete. And so they'll prematurely stop the program. Also, your company can just change directions. Again, this is why you have to be dynamic and accept change. Your company can be a neuro company and suddenly decide that they want to do immuno-oncology and stop your program. So I've heard tales of this. Merck Frost in Montreal went through this, where they just completely changed focus and shut down programs. And so, but if you are a scientist and you're really interested in science for the sake of science, then you'll easily shift and get intrigued and challenged by a new area, and it can be quite exciting because you're not pigeonholed into one area for your entire career. So what I've outlined here is sort of the small molecule drug discovery pipeline, and wanted to give you guys a sense of where I fit and where I think most people fit after going through my sort of career path of doing a degree, or whether it's a master's or PhD in basic science, and then moving into a biotech and a small molecule company such as I did. So really the whole pipeline starts with identifying a target and validating it, and then running screens to identify small molecules that modify that drug target. And then you go through lead discovery and lead optimization. So optimizing that molecule for development, and then studying it in preclinical animal models. Not included there is just understanding the mechanism of action. And then it goes into clinical trials. So phase 1 safety, phase 2 is some efficacy and safety, and phase 3 is your really large study. And then finally, FDA review and approval. So typically someone with my background comes in sort of on the left-hand side. So, focusing on target ID validation, and then working with the chemist to go through and develop any identified chemical matter to develop it into a drug candidate. There are people who will, eventually end up in like phase 1, phase 2 studies. There are needs for biologists at those stages, but honestly, it usually requires additional training and a lot of experience before you transition into working in those later stages of the pipeline. So to give you a sense, just quickly, on what these early stages of small molecule drug discovery are, it's initiated because there's really an unmet medical need. I think that's important to stress, and I think is what makes it exciting to work in this space, is that you are working to address something that patients need. And so you can already from the beginning start thinking about how you're going to be impacting patients and impacting someone's life. So even if you're at this really early stage of the pipeline, you're part of this bigger engine that's going to have this really great impact potentially on patient health. So it does become very motivating, and if you're at the right company with the right culture, you're going to feel, even though your role is to be a bench scientist running routine assays, you're part of this larger mandate that can be quite inspiring. And in the beginning, you're really focused on developing, your hypothesis about what's going to happen if you inhibit or activate your target, and what will be the therapeutic effect. And then you have to validate that biology, and then you have to help the chemists optimize those small molecules. And so you can see that how your training in academia in terms of developing a hypothesis, developing experiments to test that hypothesis really come into play here. So again, your training as with your master's degree or your PhD degree is really going to be helpful in setting you up for success during these, or even at these early stages of drug discovery. We move forward. We can skip this one because I think I've spoken to it. So what I wanted to emphasize is really drug discovery is a team effort. And to be honest, this is sometimes something that academics struggle with as they're coming out of their studies, or if they were a PI in an academic at a university and move into biotech or big pharma. Often people will struggle with this whole idea of team effort, because no matter, as I said, whether you're the bench scientist or the CMO or the translational scientist, you're all working for this common goal of impacting patient health or meeting an unmet medical need. And so you're not working on your own project and your own success. You're working towards the success of the company or your program. And you have biologists, you have pharmacologists, you have medicinal chemists, and you have analytical chemists. So this is when I said in the beginning that having that training of working in a multidisciplinary environment is really helpful. And I got this out of working during my postdoc, is just working with different people who look at the same problem differently really sets you up for success. So what the biologists do are usually developing assays and reagents. They're working on validating that target biology and mechanism of action. And also a lot of what they do is testing compounds, seeing how they're behaving in those routine assays as the chemists are improving the compounds from week to week. The pharmacologists test those compounds in various in vivo models. This was a huge change for me and speaks to a difference between academia and industry. So your pharmacologists are the people who handle the animal model. So I was a trained immunologist. Immunologists usually do their own mouse work. So within the first couple of weeks, I was like, I need some cells from bone marrow. I was gonna just walk over to the animal facility and collect my bones. And oh my God, that was the biggest mistake because that was their job and they were totally offended by me just walking into the animal facility. So that's their mandate. So it was nice. I learned to appreciate that I had someone else who could do all that work for me, but they really focus on that. And it's really an area of expertise on how to administer compounds and how to analyze their activity in vivo. Then you have your medicinal chemists who are making those compounds that are going to be tested in vitro and in vivo and are really the ones who get the glory when they identify the molecule that's going to become a drug candidate and move into the clinic. Lastly, you have your analytical chemists. So they really evaluate the physiochemical and pharmacokinetic properties of the compounds. And this was something I wasn't aware of until I got into industry, but it's a whole different area that I say analytical chemists, but there are some people who come into that area with a biology background. So it's referred to as DMPK, a DMPK scientist. So if anyone is interested in the cross-section of biology and chemistry, that's a field of study that you should consider. It's quite in high demand in Canada right now and can be quite rewarding and high-paying career choice. If we move forward, okay, so realities of working in industry. And again, I preface this by saying this is my perspective and from what I've learned over the years. So you're going to have to, as I alluded this to, you have to work within what is the strategy of the company, and you're not guided by solely your own scientific interests. This is particularly true in a biotech with limited funds and on strict timelines. So you really have to be focused on what is the question that the company needs to address. And you're going to be asked to pivot quickly. So if you're the type of person who gets really attached to their science and has to characterize every little aspect of your biology, I would say think cautiously before switching into industry, just because it's not what's good and what's bad. It's just what's going to suit your approach to science and what kind of scientist you are. And lastly, you're really going to be required to work cross-functionally. And I keep on saying this throughout the slides I'm presenting, where you're going to have to present to people who have different backgrounds than you, and it's going to be vetted. And they're going to have an opinion about everything that you do. And this was a big learning curve for me as well. When I started, I was like, I want to do my experiment. I want to do my N of 3. I want to do all the controls, make sure I understand everything perfectly. And then I'm going to present to you. And I still feel like that at times for people who are working under me and are doing work. I want them everything to be perfect before we move it up higher up the chain. But the reality is oftentimes we can't delay. And so because biotech is working so quickly, some of the lead executives need to know how things are progressing, what things are looking at before the entire story is complete and you've put a pretty bow on it. If you move forward. Okay, so again, I'm just driving home some points or some themes that I've mentioned already, but what you need to succeed, you have to be able to work collaboratively You have to have a wide variety of scientific interests, be super analytical, be able to communicate and present well, and then be okay with, contributing your talent and your expertise towards a common goal. So again, it's not so much about you, but about the common goal of making the company succeed or the project that you are working on succeed. If you move forward. Now, this is a question that I often get is like, what's biotech versus big pharma? I'll preface this by saying I've always been in biotech. I haven't been in big pharma, but I've worked with a lot of people who were in big pharma. So my company, Ventus, has a lot of people that used to be at Merck Frost, or people that used to be at Celgene, which is sort of a mid-sized company, or BMS. So I do, have some sense of the differences that I can speak to. Of course, these are biases though, but I would say biotech tends to be a little bit more innovative and high risk scientific approaches. Big pharma in general like to mitigate risk as much as possible, and they do this by looking for novel science from biotech and licensing it. Biotech tends to be a more informal working environment. There seems to be that sort of mentality of, because you're starting it from scratch. So you have, a small number of people that are working to build up this company. So there's this really like, we're in this together spirit, and let's just do whatever we have to do to get the job done. There's no sense of this is my job title or this is my job description. This is what I do. And you really, if you're there from the beginning, which is what I really appreciated, is that you get to be part of the decision-making process. So you get visibility to all different aspects of the company, and you get to have a voice if you pick a company with the right culture. Big pharma is typically much more of a hierarchy. Oftentimes employees can sort of get pigeonholed into one area, and you're thought of, you're a bench scientist that runs these types of assays. So you end up just doing that for long stretches of your career. Biotech, I would say more often than not, has more resources in academia in terms of like finances. But then, you often will out license as you're getting towards the clinic, because a clinical trial is extremely expensive. Whereas big pharma, obviously they're the ones with the deep pockets and have more money and more resources. So if you move to the next slide, biotech, you have to deal with the reality that you can be acquired and then there can be layoffs. But honestly, I think in today's day and age, from my perspective, there's no such thing as job security, whether you're talking about academia, biotech, or big pharma. So please don't make that decision of where you go based on job security, because it's a false reality. It doesn't exist. Big pharma has been laying off people for years, and as they've pivoted and changed their focus. So it can happen in big pharma as well. I do think that in terms of opportunities for advancement, because biotech, if you're coming at the beginning of the company and the small number of people, you really have an opportunity to learn a lot and advance as the companies grow. Whereas big pharma, alluding to what I said earlier about being pigeonholed, sometimes it can be harder to advance. And so your promotions may come a little bit more slowly. And then, of course, I won't lie, the advantage of biotech and big pharma, you do have this, compensation, financial compensation, such as stock options, in both biotech and big pharma, actually, which you don't have in academia. But again, do not make your decisions based on those sort of advantages, because it's never a guarantee. And again, biotechs can fold unexpectedly if things don't pan out. And I think that was my last slide. So I've left a lot of time for questions, and I'm an open book. So I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone has.
Yep, you can go ahead and you can type your question into the chat, or you can use the raise hand function, and then I'll just let you know you can unmute yourself and ask your questions. And while everyone types and thinks, I will ask another question. So you have a lot of experience, Kelly, about the academic environment versus the biotech environment. You started in the academic environment. So when you moved from more of an academia-based job to a biotech, what was something that you thought, oh, biotech is doing this the right way? This is amazing. We never did it this way in academia.
It's a really good question. What I really appreciated, and which to this day I still think is the main difference between biotech and academia, is the value that biotech will place on negative data. So I find in academia, as soon as you get negative data, everyone's super stressed because that means that my hypothesis was wrong. I can't write a paper about negative data. I can't renew my grant with negative data. What am I going to do? And I think actually this feeds into situations where you have things being published that are not reproducible. Whereas what I learned in biotech, the first time I had like a hypothesis and we did tests and the data was clearly negative, I had that guttural reaction of like, oh no. And my mentor at that time was like, this is great, because if this is negative, it's a no-go decision. So this is one thing we don't have to worry about and we don't pursue anymore. And it helps us focus, because focus is critical to advancing, and which is important for your strict timelines. So for me, being able and being comfortable with negative data was very liberating.
Awesome. Tara, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, thank you. So I just happened to come across this advertisement for your talk and was really interested. So Leslie, you don't know who I am and nobody else does, but I work, we're sort of affiliated with Global Nexus. I'm a program manager that's doing COVID research in long-term care. And I think I'm kind of where you were when you maybe made that leap to industry, in that I'm not, although I'll be teaching next semester, not in that sort of academic position that I always aspired to be in, for quite a few reasons, children and the pandemic, to list a few reasons. But and I feel like, I don't know if you were in the same situation, but it's almost like we're in a bit of a gig economy where, COVID's wrapping up and I need to think about what's next. We have things in the pipeline, but my contract technically ends at the end of December, and they say, well, we'll fund you until the end of March. But these 3-month, 6-month, year-long sort of intervals are taxing, and I'm always wondering, do I look for work? Sounds like you still don't have a whole lot of job stability in industry. Is that fair to say? In that you never know when you're going to get laid off, or would you say there's more job stability in industry than there is in academia?
I don't really believe that there's job security anywhere. Like the days of I think there are, right, Leslie, some professors who still have tenure. And I guess that is the ultimate form of job security. But I do know that there's less and less opportunities to have tenure, even within your university these days. So aside from tenured positions, I don't think job security really exists. But I think that as long as you're picking companies where you're excited about the science, where you think that there's value to the science, maybe that company is going to close at some point, but you will have gained this experience that's going to set you up for your next position. And it's about the progress that you're making as you're going from one position to another, your learnings, you're going to develop as a scientist, you're going to, elevate your position within the companies if that's what you want. I think the days are gone of people getting a job and staying at that job for 50 years or their entire careers, unless, again, you're really interested in a tenured position and you're successful in securing one. But I tend not to focus on the job security. I tend to focus on an exciting opportunity.
Okay. My follow-up question was then, how far into the future do you feel secure in your position? And are you constantly looking to see what, where you could go next, or are you pretty?
No, not at all. So I'll give you an example. So I joined Inception. I was there from 2016 till 2019. And keep in mind, I'm in Montreal. So Ventus is located in both Montreal and Boston. I'm localized in the Montreal site. There's not much biotech in Montreal. There are very few options, right? But I was there from 2016 to 2019. Then there was a decision to, so Ventus had a site, Inception had 3 sites, Montreal, Vancouver, and San Diego. And they decided to break up the 3 sites, and each site was given an opportunity to reinvent itself. I decided to stay on. I've been with Ventus from then, from 2019 till now, which is a good run. And honestly, I don't look elsewhere because I'm excited about the science that we're doing. We're lucky in terms of we're funded. We have a long runway. I think I would only start looking for another opportunity if suddenly, our cash runway was super slow and I didn't see opportunity for us to bring in more money. So I know I'm not giving you a clear answer of like, oh, every 2 years you're going to jump to a new company. It's just not the reality of how it works. You just have to find a company that you're passionate about, that you're excited about the science, and develop as a scientist in that situation.
I think one thing you said, Kelly, that sort of addresses this too is when you were talking about the places you were, you said you worked with people who were from Merck, and some people had come from somewhere else. So I get the sense that it's, there may be some moving around, but that people who have the experience wouldn't spend a long time unemployed.
Yeah. I think that if you're experienced and you're good at what you do, you'll find a position. Even in places like Montreal and Toronto, there are positions for scientists. I'm an eternal optimist, so I do see opportunities. You just have to be flexible and willing to, like I did, bite your tongue and suck it up and be a little bit humble to learn, in a new environment.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, Annika, go ahead.
Hello, thank you very much for your talk. It was very informative. I just have a question about, I'm not sure how common this is, but if you decide to go from industry and you work there for a while, is it possible to transition back into academia if you find that after a few years it's not for you, or the company you're working with, you're not, it doesn't work out?
So I think as a bench scientist, definitely. I think even you would be very attractive to an academic lab. If you had 4 years of industry experience, I would think that an academic PI should be very excited to recruit you after that, because you will have acquired certain standardized skills that would really help them. Where it becomes challenging is if you want to go back and become a principal investigator at a university or a research institute. That can be challenging. It is done, but it's challenging because you're not going to publish as much when you're in industry, which, as you alluded to, is really what your output is as an academic. So it's going to be hard to get that PI position if you haven't published for the last 5 years that you were in industry.
So then would you, say you transition back into academia and you go into a lab to do, you maybe are a research associate or something like that, and then you publish through there, could you then move to be a PI?
I think Leslie could probably answer that better than I do. I don't have experience in that area.
So I would say whenever you have a non-traditional route, it is harder, I would say, in academia, and that's maybe because people have an idea that a traditional path is the way to go. But I think people are learning more that there are things to be learned from industry, and that we can get some really good people who have those industry links. So I can tell you that Andrew MacArthur, who's here at Mac, before he was a professor here at Mac, he did work in industry for a while. And in his case, his skill set was one that we really wanted to recruit to Mac. And so the skills that he had acquired, throughout his academic career, but also in industry, were valuable. So he did that. There's also Melissa Perot, who's at Guelph. She also worked in industry before she came back to academia. So I would say it's not as common as the traditional, PhD postdoc and then academic position, but it is possible to do.
Okay. And then if you receive, like, you go to do your PhD in another country, is that like you could do your PhD, say, in like England or Switzerland or like Sweden or something like that? And then would you still, like, a PhD is a PhD, would you still have the same like still be desired by like industry companies working in North America if you've done your schooling elsewhere?
So if you mean, would you be, when we recruit to industry, do we care if the PhD comes from North America or Europe?
Yeah.
No, I would say it's really about the experience that the candidate has and the demonstration of that experience, whether it's publications or other talks, seminars, abstracts at conferences. So really, that's what we're going to probe. And if you're coming in, they're going to probe extensively your technical experience. So really making sure that you can actually do what you say you do and how well you communicate your knowledge.
Okay.
So definitely, I have never hired someone based on that, on giving more weight to a McGill, for example, or a McMaster's PhD versus one from somewhere in the UK.
Okay, thank you.
We have time for probably one more question if anybody wants to raise their hand up and go ahead. Oh, I got a hand somewhere.
Like Tara.
Oh, it's Tara. Go ahead.
Me again. Just a question. If you had the option to go back, I guess maybe following up on that last question, if you were given the opportunity to run your own lab at McGill or stay in your position now, would it be a tough choice or would you absolutely?
No, I made the right choice for me, because where I've ended up now is, I think, really what I'm really excited about is being the person that sort of straddles the basic science and how it's going to be executed in the clinic. So I could only find this sort of scenario in industry. I don't think I could be an academic and doing this type of work at the level that I am now, meaning that we're going to be dosing patients, like we're dosing patients this month and next month, and I've had the opportunity to influence, what biomarkers we're looking at and then analyzing the data as it comes in. That would not have been an option for me if I stayed in academia. So I don't think at this stage of my career, I wouldn't want to let that go. I'm really excited about having that opportunity, and I've always been a real basic scientist at heart. I still am. Everyone within the company knows that that's where I get most excited, but I've found a niche where I can make that basic science impactful. So I wouldn't want to give that up.
Awesome. Thank you.
No problem.
Kelly, one of the other things that I've asked a few other people as well is once you get into, and you could talk specifically about your company if you like, but once you get into the biotech, is there also opportunity to do additional training, either, official, getting you a certificate, or unofficial, just,
Yeah.
I guess unofficial would be yes, but could you get into the company, do additional training? Would they support that and let you sort of shift into other jobs?
I think so. I think it depends on the company and the culture within the company. But if you have a good culture, then I've seen it time and time again. I'll give you a really, an example that comes to mind. We had someone who came in as a administrative assistant, or she was an executive administrative assistant. But she was getting bored doing that. And since we've transitioned into being a clinical company, she was really interested in supporting the clinical operations. So being the person who coordinates the interactions between our clinical pharmacologists and the agency running our clinical trials, making sure all the paperwork is in place and all this. That requires a very specific skill set. You can't just do that. You need to be trained to do that. It's highly, highly regulated, lots of rules. So she was reporting to the CEO, and she expressed this to him and got her the training, and she's now moved on to that side of the company, and he's hired another executive assistant. So there are opportunities, and likewise, we have scientists who want to move from biologists who suddenly get interested in DMPK. Again, it requires training, so we've allowed them to train and transition into that area. So if you have a good culture, then it should be possible.
That's great. All right, we're getting close to the hour, so I'm just going to take the last 2 minutes to thank Dr. Kelly Pike for taking time out of her day to talk to us. Thank you, Kelly. We can get a virtual applause from everybody.
You're welcome.
Next week, we have Ryan Wiley from Shift Health, who's coming to talk to us, so tune in next week as well. Thanks for coming, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.